Hey, so in this video, I'm going to cover Terraform state and remote states, and we're going to learn how to use both and also how to move our state file from local to an S3 bucket. So if you want to follow along, this is Module 4 of my Building with Terraform course. Let's get into it. All right, so we are in Module 4 of my course, Building with Terraform, and today we are going to look into Terraform state and understand the differences between local state and remote state. So let's go ahead and dive into it. Link in the description below to my GitHub here so you can follow along. But yeah, so let's talk about Terraform state. So honestly, one of the best benefits of Terraform is that we can keep track of resource state. So what this means is if we build a resource with Terraform, say in AWS S3 bucket, we build that with Terraform, it gets deployed on AWS. If that resource gets changed, maybe someone uses a CLI command or they go into the console and make a change to that bucket, the next time we run Terraform, Terraform will detect that change. It'll detect it as a deviation from what was defined in the code. And so what this means is if we rerun our Terraform code, it will revert the changes back to what is defined in the code. So this is, an awesome benefit of Terraform is that drift detection and the ability to revert the state back to what is defined in that code. So let's go ahead and dive into an example here. So if you've been following along, you've created the S3 bucket with me. If not, just go ahead and you can copy the code right here. But what we're going to do here is my bucket right now does not have versioning enabled. If I go into my bucket here in AWS, I can go to properties and see that bucket versioning is currently set to disabled. That is exactly what is defined in my Terraform code because by default, when you push this code out, the bucket versioning is just not set. So we're going to go ahead and change that. And we're going to enable the bucket versioning so that we could later disable it and so we can detect what drift actually is and how Terraform is going to revert that drift. So this will be a great example. To enable bucket versioning, we can refer to the Terraform documentation here. And this is the resource to use right here, AWS S3 bucket versioning. If we go down to the argument reference, we can understand that the bucket name is required. Also the versioning configuration, but the other two things are optional. So let's go ahead, we're going to create a new resource here. And again, you can just copy this code that I have here. Just like that. Okay, I'm going to save that. Make sure everything is good here. So bucket equals, in this case, so we're pulling the name from our bucket. So this is our bucket. Now we need to get the bucket name. To do that, we call out this AWS S3 bucket, and then the reference name of that bucket. So I have a quick typo here I need to adjust because I have an underscore up here and a dash here. So let's go ahead and change that to an underscore, and it'll be the ID of the bucket, which is the bucket name. And then versioning configuration here. We can go back to the documentation, see below, versioning configuration. So status is required and it supports either enabled, disabled, or suspended. So real quick, just for some background, some clarity, if you're not sure what bucket versioning is, bucket versioning allows us to keep historic data. So if we put data into an S3 bucket and then we go and overwrite that data with some new data, we can revert back to that old data. If bucket versioning is not turned on, which it's not by default. So if it's not turned on and we overwrite data, that old data is just lost forever. But when we have versioning enabled, we can restore that data. So in this case, with that in mind, bucket versioning enabled means that we'll have that ability to restore data. By default, it's in a disabled mode, so it's not turned on, and then suspended. So if you enable bucket versioning and then you later want to disable it, it's going to put it into a suspended mode. So that's where that comes from. So I'm going to set the status right here. And as you can see, I have set a variable. So var.aws s3 buckets versioning. So let's go ahead and just make this a bit bigger here. I'm going to go into my variables file because now we need to set that. So we'll come down here, we'll create a new variable, and I had named it this right here. Okay, we can go ahead and set a description, completely optional, but this is, let's see, description equals modifies the S3 buckets versioning configuration. All right, now we're going to do a type, and it will be a string here, and then we'll set the default, and that will be set to enabled. So what this means here is it will do status equals this variable, and the default setting is set to enabled. All right, so now that we have the code updated, let's go back to the course. So we've updated our main.tf. We have the bucket versioning information in there. We updated our variables file right there. Now we're going to go ahead and do a Terraform. Well, we have to do a Terraform init first, if you haven't already, and then we will do a Terraform plan. And I have a typo. Let's see. So my issue was that my file was not saved. So if I go ahead and do a Terraform plan again, it should just work. Yep, there we go. So here we go. We are now creating this new resource, which is the bucket versioning resource. But all we're doing is updating our current bucket here that we've set right here. That's our bucket name. And then we are turning versioning configuration status to enabled. So let's go ahead and apply that. Type in yes. And there we go. So if we go back to our bucket over here in the console, we can go to properties, scroll down to bucket versioning. We can see that bucket versioning is in fact enabled. All right, so now that that's set, let's go back to our course here. So we've done the Terraform plan, we have applied it. Now we're going to go ahead and demonstrate drift. So what you can do if you have the AWS CLI set up, you can go ahead and copy and paste this command and run that. What this is going to do is this will suspend the bucket versioning. So you can't go from enabled to disabled, but you can go from enabled to suspended. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that in the CLI. I'll show you how to do it in the console here in a second. All right, so we need to put our bucket name in here. Let's go grab that bucket name, which is right here. This is the bucket name. We'll copy that. We'll paste that. And we can go ahead and hit enter. Now I've got my AWS CLI tool set up, so this should work just fine. All right, let's go back into our bucket, refresh the page here. And we can see that we are in fact in a suspended state. Now I'm going to go back and put that into enabled, and then I'll show you how to adjust this in the console. Okay, if we refresh the page here, go back into the bucket, we can see bucket versioning is enabled. So if you want to change it in the console, you go into the bucket, you click on properties, you go into edit, and then you can see right here, we don't have an option to disable, it's only to suspend. So we click suspend, we acknowledge that, and then we hit save changes. So now we're in that suspended state. So if we go back to the course here, we've done the plan, or actually we have to do a new plan to see the drift. So we'll do a Terraform plan. And what's going to happen is Terraform is going to detect drift because what we have set here in this versioning configuration, if we look at our variable, we have it set to enabled. If we look back at our bucket is set to suspended. So if I do a Terraform plan here, it's going to alert me that it will change. And this is what that looks like. So after a Terraform plan, it pulls in the bucket, it refreshes the states, and we can see that it wants to do an update in place. It shows you right here for the resource of the bucket versioning. It wants to change the status from suspended, which is what it currently is here in the AWS console, to enabled, which is what we have it set here in the code. So if I go ahead and do a Terraform apply right now, and then type in yes once it prompts me. It's going to tell us again that we are modifying the resource from suspended to enabled. We'll click on enter. Okay, complete, one resource changed. Refresh our bucket over here, and we can see that the bucket versioning is now back to enabled. So this is exactly what I meant by how Terraform can detect drift, because it understands the state of the resource as it was defined in the code. And if we try to run the code again, you saw down here when we did the apply in the plan, it was refreshing the state, pulling in the current state of the bucket. It detected that deviation, that the bucket versioning was set to suspended rather than enabled as defined in the code. So when we reran our Terraform, that's when it put that bucket versioning back to enabled, since that was what was defined here in our code. All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So now we're going to get into Terraform state files. And this is exactly how Terraform understands how it tracks a resource's state. So I'm going to clear my screen here. And what happens is after we run Terraform plan and apply, it creates these state files. Now, if we do an ls, we can see the two state files here. And we can go ahead and open those up too. I'm going to do a star. This will open up both of those files. We can see here's the terraform.tf state. And see, we can see those outputs that we had called out. It tracks that. It tracks the resource. It tracks all these different attributes. And then there's a backup file here as well. So this is how Terraform understands what the resource should be configured with, all the different properties, etc. So I'm going to show you what that means. If we go ahead and delete those files, so I'm going to do an rm to remove. We're going to do a force of terraform.tf state. I'll do a star. You have to be careful when you run this command here, but I am currently just going to delete these two files. If I do an ls again, those files are gone. So what happened here is I just deleted the state. Terraform has no idea now that this resource exists, and I'll prove it to you. So if we do a Terraform plan here, see, plan to add. So it wants to create these two resources, that being the S3 bucket and the bucket versioning, because I deleted the state files. So now it doesn't know that that bucket already exists. And here's the issue when your state is messed up or just doesn't exist, is if I do a Terraform apply, it's going to fail, because it's going to try to create these buckets and the bucket versioning, and it already exists. It tells you right here, bucket already exists. And that's because in the variables file, we hard-coded our bucket name right here. If I change the bucket name, yeah, it would create a new bucket. So what happened here is Terraform doesn't know the state. It doesn't know that the bucket exists. It just knows, hey, you ran a Terraform apply. Let me go ahead and push this. And then it errors out because it's trying to create a bucket with this name. And if you remember, the bucket name has to be unique. Now what you can do here, and we're actually going to talk about this, I believe in the next module, is we're going to talk about importing existing resources into a state file. And if we import these resources, we can bring it back into states, and everything would be good. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on, and that's completely okay. That if you followed along and you broke your state like I did, that's completely okay. We'll be able to go through this next part just fine. So we have local and remote state files. Now I showed you those local files. That was right here. So this is what's called a local state file because it's right here in your directory. And so let's talk about that for a minute. If you're working for a company, you're going to have multiple people that are sometimes working on the same project, the same code. They're working on building the same infrastructure. Maybe someone needs to modify it. Now, if you shared this code with a coworker and they tried to run it, unless they had the state file, they're going to run into the same issue that we just did, which was they're going to try to do an apply, and Terraform isn't going to understand that these resources already exist. So it's going to go ahead and try to create those, and then it's going to error out again because that resource exists. So what do? You would have to share this terraform.tf state file with your coworker. And now we're talking about copying and pasting and sharing files, and there could be file corruption, there could be file duplication. It's going to lead to all sorts of problems. So sharing your local TF state file is not the best approach. Luckily, HashiCorp offers a whole bunch of different options for setting up what's called a remote Terraform state file. And we can look at the documentation here, and we can see all the different types of options. So I'm under the backends here, and then you can see the available backends. You've got remote, you've got Azure RM, console, Kubernetes, there's an S3. So these are all places where you can store this Terraform state file, which can then be shared by multiple people. So right here it gives you an example configuration. And this should look fairly familiar, this Terraform block here. This is actually in our providers file. Terraform right here. So what we're going to do is that we're actually going to copy this code to our providers file, and then this is going to allow us to use our S3 bucket that we created as the back end. So back in our course here, you can of course just copy this as well. You can see here's our original provider file, and then we're going to update it by adding in that back end code. So I'm going to copy this right here, and we will paste this right there. I'm going to hit save there. All right, and so what we're going to do here is we need the bucket name. Go ahead and specify your region that you're using. And then I have encrypt in here for the enabling server-side encryption. And then the only other thing is the key. So this can be, whatever name you want. I've just named it terraform.tfstates. Now let's replace this bucket name with our existing bucket that we've already created, which is right up here. So I'm going to copy that, make sure it's in quotes, save that. Now rerun the Terraform init. All right, so here we go. Do you want to copy the existing state to the new backend? So this is going to take our local state file and then copy that to our S3 bucket. So if we hit yes, and then we can hit enter, and it's going to do that migration for us. So as we can see here, successfully configured the backend S3, and Terraform will automatically use this backend unless the backend configuration changes. So let's see what happens here. So if we do a Terraform plan here, we're going to create a new bucket. We're going to set the versioning. We're going to go ahead and hit yes. Oops. We are going to do a Terraform apply, I should say. We'll type yes. We're going to create a new bucket here. Let's go back into our buckets, refresh here. So we have real quick, we have the original one, which in my case is 1BA3. And then we're going to have a new one, which is this 234. So we can come in here. We can see here's our new bucket. Versioning is set to enabled. Now, if we go back to the original bucket, this is our new backend for the remote state file of Terraform. We click in there. Now we can see that we have a terraform.tfstate file in here. So what this means that if we download this, well, hold on. All right, so we can go ahead and now delete our terraform.tfstate file here. And I just wanted to do this just for the sake of the demo, so there's no confusion. My local state file is completely gone. Now, if I download this remote state file here, we can go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and open that. Downloads, I named it Terraform. What did I name it? TF. There we go. And just to show you, it's the exact same file. Now it's housed in the S3 bucket. And so now you can share this code with your coworkers, and as long as within their provider's file they are pointed at the correct bucket and the correct Terraform state file here, or the key as defined here, then they'll be able to run this code and leverage that state. All right, so let's go back into the course. I believe we are done, but let's just make sure we wrapped everything up. We did the plan. We removed those local state files. Oh, we do have one more section just to cover. It's not hands-on, but this is about information disclosure in Terraform state files. So we need to be cognizant of the data that is kept in these Terraform state files. So as you can see, we have things like, bucket names, we've got the domain names, the bucket IDs, all sorts of things that could potentially be sensitive, especially if we're creating a lot more resources like IAM roles and the permission files associated with that. Like, this is just all information. It's an information disclosure here if this were to become compromised and viewed by someone that we don't want them to know about our environment. And so if you're using local Terraform state file, that's on your computer, right? Your computer could become compromised. That file could easily be found. But if we store it all in a backend that's nice and secure, like we could do an S3 bucket here, we could go ahead and lock down our bucket to make sure it's not public facing. We can also define a bucket policy, or you can define an IAM policy that restricts access to who can access this bucket and download that Terraform state file. So by putting it into a backend that you can control and you can lock down, we can minimize the risk of that information disclosure of potentially sensitive data in our Terraform state files. But yeah, with that being said, this is it. So hopefully that was helpful. Stay tuned. We're going to have a lot more videos here. I've got some future topics that I'll be working on, and I'll post the course material here in GitHub, and then I'll continue to make some YouTube videos for this. So I'll see you in the next one.